when it comes to change and transformation and these kinds of transitions, you often have a catalyst in your life, because otherwise we just continue on because life's comfortable, and that's a lot better than feeling uncomfortable, right? So I
Yes.
had a major, major catalyst, and I was sick at the time, and I took myself off that day and I listened to a podcast. And the woman was talking about how she'd lived her whole life trapped in this invisible prison of anxiety and fear.
Yes.
And when I listened to her story, I realized, wow, that's also my story.
Welcome to the Audacious Living Podcast, hosted by my man, Audley Stephenson, the Odd Man.
Greetings and salutations. Welcome to the Audacious Living Podcast, where our ongoing goal is to inspire and empower our listeners to live their best, audacious lives ever. I'm thrilled to have you here with us and appreciate the fact that you've taken time out of your day to join us. Now, mastering your energy is like tuning into a radio station. When you align your frequencies, the signal comes in clear and strong. Just as our interview with Gabrielle Pinstone, who's here and shares her insights on transforming energy at an energetic level. And we'll talk a little bit what that means. Gabrielle is an experienced energy coach and transformation expert with over 27 years of experience in psychology. She specializes in guiding individuals through the life transitions and releasing energetic blocks to help them live both authentically and fearlessly. In this episode, Gabrielle shares her journey of transitioning from a corporate career to becoming an energy coach. Her insights on facing fears, releasing limiting beliefs, and embracing change resonate very much with the theme of living audaciously. So now that we've got you all set, let's turn to our conversation with Gabrielle. Enjoy. Hey, Gabrielle, thank you for joining me here today on the Audacious Living Podcast. It's great for you to make the time to do this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Audley. It's great to be here, and hi to your audience.
Yes. So, here on this podcast, we talk often and always about, that best audacious life ever, and the things that people can do to get there. And certainly life has its challenges, and there's detours, and there's things that, take us further from that path that we're intended to be on or rather be on. And I know that's part of the work that you do as an energy coach. And so maybe as a starting point, we could describe it about your work, because you yourself went through your own transition to get there. And so maybe we can fill it for our audience a little about you and the work that you do.
That sounds great. Thank you so much. I did. I had a major transition, and I wasn't young when it happened. I was 50. It was a few years ago. And I had been in a corporate career for 27 years. I was a senior leader, often in banks. I worked in banking. I was also a consultant. And I worked in the field of organizational psychology. So I loved my work. I was hugely identified with it. And then in 2020, I had a moment of reckoning where I was in a leadership role in a bank, typical scenario, but I wasn't coping anymore. So the things that I used to just really accept about corporate life had started to really affect me on a deeply personal level. I wasn't sleeping. I was very, very isolated from the world around me because I had no energy to deal with others. I was depressed. I was anxious. And then I woke up one morning, it was a Sunday morning,
Mhm.
and I had this really sick pit in my stomach, and I knew something was really wrong.
Right.
And that was my moment of saying, what's going on here, and how do I fix it? And a career change is not a major adversity, but when you're 50 and it's all you know, and your identity is so
Yeah.
tied up
Yeah.
with it, it can become very bumpy.
Yeah. And what I can see in that is that it's, and again, to that point, but you're in this career for so many years, and then suddenly there's a need to course correct or change. And
Correct.
the longer that you're into something, without question, the harder it is. So,
Yes.
I'm curious. And what kind of steps did you take, or how did you navigate that piece? That's a big one on itself.
Well, I navigated it carefully. I'm not like a reckless person. And I think, when it comes to change and transformation and these kinds of transitions, you often have a catalyst in your life, because otherwise we just continue on because life's comfortable, and that's a lot better than feeling uncomfortable, right? So I
Yes.
had a major, major catalyst, and I was sick at the time, and I took myself off that day and I listened to a podcast, and the woman was talking about how she'd lived her whole life trapped in this invisible prison of anxiety and fear.
Yes.
And when I listened to her story, I realized, wow, that's also my story. So what I did was, actually, the first thing I did was, the next day I phoned the employee assistance program, had a chat with them, and then I resigned from that job. But I didn't
Wow.
leave the corporate world in its entirety, because I kind of went back to contract and partnered up with some lovely people, and did some work in the corporate space for a number of years.
Right.
And so what was important for me, because I was someone who lived with anxiety, was not to add to that anxiety, and to
Mm,
find a way to transition out. And I would call my story more of an evolution than anything else. And that's the way that I've learned works best for me when it comes to fear, is to not to avoid the fear,
right.
to face into it, but to do it in a way that doesn't feel overly risky.
I love very much the way that you're very, so you knew yourself, and to know very much the things you can and can't do, and to talk about not adding
Yes,
to the
yes,
stress, not building upon yourself and making it more
yes,
difficult. And so I think that's a
yes.
really key lesson to learn, that just be clear on knowing who you are and
Yes.
what you want yourself, right? Is that
Yes, that's right. And put boundaries around, like put parameters around your transition. So for
mm,
me, I had a number of very practical strategies that I followed, but I also had psychological strategies that I followed to keep me um, moving forward and not stalling in my progress. Yeah.
you sort of found a way that, and we just talked about, the longer you're in something, the more challenging and difficult it is, and I accept that to be totally true. But by the same token, the longer you're in something, the more you know about that something, right? And the more you can use that knowledge that you have to translate it into other areas.
Well, that's exactly right. I love what you're saying about the longer you're in something, the more difficult it is to shift out of it, because you're talking about identity to a large extent.
Mm-hmm.
And, when we tell ourselves something for long enough, or when we sit in the status quo for long enough, it becomes part of who we are and our identity. Unraveling that is difficult. And I always talk, because I worked in organizational transformation, so I've worked with human transformation. One of the most difficult things that we face when we're trying to change our lives is not learning new things, but unlearning. And that's what you're talking about. The older you get, the more difficult it is, because the more things have solidified.
Right, right. So,
Yeah.
okay, so now that we've figured that out, what, when we talk about a starting point? So now we figured out, we know it's hard, right? So we've been very clear on that, and if this podcast ended right now, we would know that it's hard. So we know that piece. The next steps, and
Yes.
how do we, what should we be looking at doing then?
Well, I think the first step in any change process, and anything, you're going through a challenge, is to find a way to get into a non-resistant state. Because, there are so many things that keep us held back, that keep us stuck, that keep us in a resistant state, limiting beliefs, stories, identity. And so it's really important that we consciously and mindfully get out of a non-resistant state, and get out of a resistant state and into non-resistance. So for me, the non-resistance was, and I think this really does speak to the topic of your podcast, which is all about courage. It is around, it doesn't mean you don't feel fear, but you've got to work really hard not to be the fear. And so what that means is you've got to lean into the fear, but you have to do it anyway. You've got to choose to act despite the fear. And so it's a decision we make to move forward regardless of the fear we feel about it. In my case, and in many people's case, the fear of staying still overshot the fear of moving forward. And that's really the place you got to get to.
So then talk about how the whole idea in your work around energy mastery fits into these transitions that we're talking about.
Yeah. Okay. So I worked in psychology for 27 years and, I was in therapy for a large part of that. I was part of my, process, and I love therapy. But I remember my therapist once saying to me, you live in your head too much and your thoughts have become like an alibi. They're holding you back. You should actually leave therapy and move into a more kind of spiritual, heart-centered place. But regardless of that, I stayed with her for a long time. For me, what happened was in 2020, when I was very stuck, I realized that my old tools that I'd learned through my work in psychology no longer worked. I couldn't move my way out of this impasse. And I didn't know, I knew I needed a different modality. I just didn't know what it was.
Okay.
And then, those pesky cookies on Instagram and Facebook. Well, I must have looked up something on Instagram. I don't know. I must have just thought it. But a few days later, I had one of those adverts come up, and this guy was talking about a 3-day extended weekend workshop all about, energy runs the show. If you want massive change in your life, you've got to work at an energetic level. And I attended that workshop and I landed up studying under that guy. What it taught me was that our thoughts, our beliefs, our emotions, our identity, the decisions we make, they are actually they have an energetic stamp. They've got an energetic frequency. And when we try and move through blocks in our life cognitively, by talking things through and thinking about it and analyzing and understanding, we can shift the dial so much, but not more, because the energetic block is still there. And when he spoke about that, I thought, well, let me try this. And I realized that this was my answer.
So again, give me the energetic block. Give me a definition of what that is.
Okay. So as we go through life, and typically in childhood, sometimes when we're even in the womb, things happen to us, like traumatic events, and they can be major traumas. Like in my case, I lost my father when I was 9, or they can be minor traumas like being bullied in the school ground, that kind of stuff. But we always experience as kids things that are unsettling. And what happens, and you'll know this from a psychological perspective, is when we are too young to process what's happened, we start to develop limiting stories and limiting beliefs about ourselves and about others and about the world around us. And those things carry an energetic frequency. So in my case, when my father was ill from the time I was 5 and he passed away when I was 9, I developed a belief deep as a child that I wasn't conscious of at the time, but it was that I've got to really worry about everything, because if I don't worry and I don't preempt disaster, I become complacent. And when I become complacent, the rug gets pulled out from under my feet. So that was my script, my life script. Now, if you think about that and you live in a constant state of hypervigilance, alertness, anxiety, always waiting for the other shoe to fall, that is a block. It sits somewhere. It's not just a thought. There's energy around it. And so these blocks, these events that happen, they create energy. The energy doesn't just go away. It gets lodged in us, gets stored in us. And then over the years, they compound and they grow bigger, because more and more stuff comes to us that reinforces our belief systems and all the stuff we're telling ourselves. And so before we know it, we've got these this residue of energy that's not going away. In fact, it's growing, and it needs to be. That's often the invisible handbrake that's holding us back, and that's why talk therapy, which I love, and it doesn't. For me, it didn't turn the dial because I was carrying the energy of terror. I was carrying the energy of trepidation and fear. And I had to release the energy around that before I could move forward. Does that make sense?
It totally makes sense. And I think as you're talking, it's very clear that these things that we're talking about are you're describing come from life events. Like this, like over the course of life. It's not like there's a special thing that happened. It was just life. I have a friend that uses the expression. They say life is lifing, right? So you're just living your life,
Yes.
and these things are naturally happening, and it's our response to these occurrences that have taken place is what's determining whether they become blocks or not.
Well, that's true. But the truth is that they often happen when we're young, where we don't have the capacity to do that. Sometimes the blocks even develop when we're in our mother's womb. If she experiences a trauma, then we take that energy on. For example, I worked with someone who wasn't actually, it wasn't a planned pregnancy, let me put it that way. And they knew that. I mean, when they were, in the mother's womb, and the mother was shocked to be pregnant, kind of resisted it for a while, all that energy passed on to the child, and they had a block. They developed a kind of a codependent relationship with people where they couldn't forge their own identity. They were enmeshed with others because they had a deep set need to belong, to be liked, all of that stuff. And so they can come to us when we're in utero. They can actually also be passed down from generation to generation, like psychological trauma. So if your grandparents or your parents didn't resolve an issue, it's in the DNA, it gets passed to you, and they're enacting it out their whole lives. So you land up imbibing and taking on that block. It gets passed to you as part of life. And that becomes challenging. I mean, these things are really invisible, Audley, but it doesn't mean they're not running the show.
Well, and what I was going to say, the process of unearthing these things must be very interesting because, especially stuff that's generational, like,
Yes.
I realize that much of the work is sort of asking these questions and to get deeper the heart of it. But still, it's almost like putting a needle in a haystack, almost like to try to find it.
Well, it is difficult, but what I've learned now when I work at an energetic level, which bypasses the conscious mind. So if you're in therapy and you're talking about your stuff,
Yes.
a lot of you might actually not be going to the unconscious because it's just too edgy or whatever the case may be. But when I'm working at an energetic level with someone and I'm reading their energy, I actually bypass that. That's the beauty of it. I can actually go into their energetic body. I can work out where the block is. I get a very strong intuitive sense about what it's about.
Right.
And then after I've released and removed it, we have a debrief, and I talk to them. I say, I found something in your heart chakra, for example, just making things up now.
Yeah.
And what I got a very strong sense of was loneliness as a young child. I got an image of you sitting, actually I'm talking about a real life client, sitting on a dusty road as a young boy, kind of all alone, and that was an actual incident. So I can read energy. If I find wherever I find it, I explain to the person where it's from. I get a sense of what it's about, and that's actually the starting point. And then they can go, oh gosh, yes. And in that case, with that client, when I was talking about them sitting on a dusty road, they said that happened to them when they were a young kid. They were in church, and they had I can't remember the details of it, but they kind of ran out of the churchyard and sat by themselves, nursing their wounds, and that's what I tapped into. So they might not have remembered that or got into that as quickly sitting in therapy because it might have sat in their unconscious. They might not have been ready, or so working at an energetic level, I can bypass all those defenses. And that's what makes it so swift and rapid.
One thing that I'm definitely hearing, particularly for these things that are deep rooted and been there for a long time, is that regardless how long that they've been there, they don't have to stay there. It doesn't mean it's like you can never not change, right? Change can happen at any point of your life. I think it's never too late, right?
Well, I'm living proof of that, Audley. I was 50 when I had my major catalyst, and I'd been in a very stable, kind of constant career my whole life. And, I keep thinking as we're talking about how things stack up over life, and that's why we spoke about earlier. It's difficult to dismantle, but it's not impossible to dismantle.
Right.
And if you work at an energetic level, what the interesting thing about working with energy is say I find an energetic root in your heart chakra, and energetic block, the root of the blocks there, I release it. We actually don't have to really know where it comes from for me to release it and for it to go. And so, although I always like to know, because I think that people need to be able to make sense of their world and what's just happened, and it really helps people if we understand what I've just released. But things compound, but it's not impossible. And I'm living proof. If we were to stop this podcast right now, my message would be to people that if I can do it at 50, and I lived with terror for decades, if I can release the root of my terror, if I can wake up every morning not with that gnawing feeling any longer, if I can go to sleep and have a peaceful 8 hours, anyone can do it, because I was like a living, walking, just fear that, and I have released that. Doesn't mean I don't feel fear, but I'm not fear. It's not my dominant frequency. I feel it appropriately, but it's not taking over my life. If I can do it, everyone can do it, but it does require a choice, and
Right.
it does require commitment.
And a little bit of work too.
A bit of work, just a little bit of work. Absolutely, it does require work. Yeah.
So let's talk about a starting point, right? So, well, actually, I would imagine that awareness that there's something going on or something needs to change is kind of where the starting point is. What would be the next step for a person to sort of take on, or what you think they would makes a good idea to do?
Yeah. So first thing, I just want to go back to what you said about the awareness that something needs to change. We know we've got a block if we have repetitive patterns in our lives,
Gotcha.
things that keep showing up that we can't fix and we don't understand them. So I think it's important to know what awareness means. What are we aware of? We're aware of patterns and we're aware of themes.
Yep.
And so that's really important. So I have a 5-step energy mastery blueprint. I know it sounds very jargony, and the first step is understanding your energy. Okay, so that we're talking about. I would say the next step, before you start working on yourself, a lot of our blocks, a lot of our dysfunction energetically comes from our environment. So I would say the next step would be to protect your energy from outside forces. Like, what is going on in your environment? What are some of the things that are bringing you down, keeping you trapped? And start there. So what that would mean in kind of psychological English terms.
Yep.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
I look like I've.
No, you're still going. You're still going.
Oh, okay, because it looks like no, there I am.
Yep.
What that would mean is making sure, for example, that if, for example, there are people in your life who are toxic, or in my case, it was a job that was toxic, that you make a decision to set boundaries, clearly defining your personal boundaries, and then either communicating them to others or making a decision to manage it. So, make sure that you eliminate what you can from your environment. Choose your company wisely. Learn to say no without feeling guilty. Release people with love. Release relationships that aren't working for you. have a digital detox, limit the information that's coming to you and be mindful of the information that you consume. Try not multitask, focus on one task, because otherwise you can start feeling really overwhelmed and drained. So there are small things we can do to just clear the environment. So I think that would be, without even working on yourself, that would make a huge difference.
Yeah, I can certainly see that
Yeah.
as a starting point, because yeah, if you like, again, it just sort of goes back to being clear on what's going on with you, why you're experiencing. There are sometimes it's easier to identify than others. Granted,
Yeah.
like that's absolutely the case. But I guess therein lies the work, and it goes back to we talked about it being a lot of work, right? Therein lies the work as a starting point.
Yeah. I think we could talk about it as work, but the other thing that I work with is the process of human transformation, because that's been my thing for 27 years.
Yep.
For me, what I've worked out is that self-growth is not work, it's a joy. It's actually, those, when you have those aha moments, there's actually nothing more fulfilling when you have a moment of, okay, that's what's going on, or when you have a self-insight, or when you work through a big barrier. I call it the gratification of transformation, because we all are hardwired for change. You said earlier, we never not changing. As human beings, we're biologically hardwired for change.
Yes.
When we resist change, we're actually going against nature. So there is joy, there is fulfillment,
Yes.
and there's this meaning in progressing. We are motivated by progress in our lives. And so it's around tapping into that. That's part of getting into the non-resistant state, is reframing what the journey of change is about. It's not work and as much as it is like a fulfilling process of, really learning more about yourself and really shifting through big things.
The word transformation you mentioned a couple of times. I really do love that, and what it does, it sets a stage for all sorts of wonderful, wonderful things. And the idea of changing. So I think, like, for some, the idea of change is can be challenging, but when you transform, that's just, even the language is just so powerful, right? Transforming.
Yes, it's very powerful, because what transforming feels like, because change feels like a struggle, feels like you're moving
Sure.
through
Yep. I
barriers,
can see
right?
that. Yep. I can see that. Yep.
Transformation, you feel like you've got to the other side. You can feel the difference. It talks to the different you on the other side of the process, of the journey. And I don't think there are many people who are not motivated by being the best versions of themselves, by living a life of greatness and fulfillment.
I love it. I love it. I love it. Gabrielle, this is so awesome.
I know.
I so appreciate. Yeah, no, I so appreciate the dialogue and the conversation. It's such an important one for us to have. So thank you for being here and sharing the way that you did. If our listeners that wanted to learn more about you, or check out your work, or connect with you, where can we send them?
Well, check out my work. You can go to my website. So I'm sure you'll have that in the
For sure.
the show notes. Yeah, that's the best place to do it. There's also a really nice 20-minute masterclass that you can download for free, which is cool. To have a dialogue with me, there are different ways to get hold of me on my website, but the easiest way, just connect with me on Instagram. Gabrielle.Pinstone. Yeah.
Awesome. Gabrielle, thank you so much for the awesome time, great insights, and keep up the fantastic work.
Thank you so much. Thank you for hosting this platform and for being such an awesome host. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. I'm blessed. Thank you. Thank you. Back right here on the podcast, and it was really good to have Gabrielle on with us here. And she emphasized the importance of facing fear, unlearning limiting beliefs, and embracing change to release energetic blocks and live a more fulfilling life. As Gabrielle's story illustrates, transformation is not just about change, but about embracing our true selves at an energetic level. By aligning our thoughts, beliefs, and emotions, we can release these blocks and step into our power with courage and intention. Thank you so much for tuning into the Audacious Living podcast. If you'd like to connect with Gabrielle directly or learn more about her work, you definitely can find her contact details below in the show notes. Don't forget to like, follow, subscribe, and share to this podcast if you haven't already done so, as these are the ways that we're able to grow and continue to inspire others to live more audaciously. Remember, your best life starts now. Keep daring great. Until next time, stay safe, be kind, show love to one another, and be audacious.
You've been listening to the Audacious Living podcast, hosted by Audley Stephenson. If you enjoyed what you heard, be sure to like, subscribe, and share. Until next time, be audacious.